Soviet Union was about to overwhelm the United States. Now I hear China's about to overwhelm the United States. Or the United States is going to go to Vietnam and teach them a lesson or two. We live as Americans manic depressive lives, particularly when it comes to politics. It is either all lost or an easy slam dunk. So in that context, I'm going to speak about enemies, Russia and China. Not really enemies, but sort of enemies. So let me begin with the question of an alliance between Russia and China. It has been brooded about that these two countries will get together, and as a result, we'll all be speaking Russian and Chinese in San Francisco. It's more complicated than that. Let's think about the problems of alliance. Firstly, geographic distance. It's a long way from Russia's wars in Ukraine and China's battles in the Pacific. It is very hard to imagine how they work together. Where do they collaborate? Where does it come together? Second, they have a really bad history with each other. You'll remember the Battle of the Ussuri River. No one else does, so you might. It was a time when the Russians and the Chinese slugged it out for an extended period of time with a lot of casualties. It opened the door for Henry Kissinger to show up in Beijing and said, why don't we dance? And dance we did. And the alliance that opened up was not between Russia and China, communist countries, but temporarily with China and the United States. The United States had listening posts out in Zeihan, listening to the Russians. I'm not sure we trusted anything that came in on it, but it was fun being out there. But China entered not into an alliance with Russia, but with the United States. Why? Because there is a deep, deep distrust by these two countries of each other. All through the 20th century, they fought wars. Russia constantly invaded China, usually at the worst possible time. And they didn't really like each other. So when we talk about an alliance, we have to first think about geography. An alliance is not a piece of paper. It is a working military organization, like the US and Britain in World War II. There was military forces working together to achieve an end. The Russians and the Chinese do not have the ability to form such a united front. There's historical tension. They don't really trust each other. Well, I didn't really trust the Brits, but what the hell, they're ours. But this has to be understood that the idea of an alliance between the two countries has to have a geographical logic and it has to have some sort of trust. Without that, it is simply the New York Times writing editorials. So let's talk about each of these countries a bit. Okay, why did Russia invade Ukraine? That Russia would invade Ukraine in the year 2020. Russia lives and dies by strategic depth. It survived Napoleon because an attack into Russia starts in the summer, I should say. That's when you get your troops mobilized. And then you move toward Moscow. And by the time you get to Moscow, you freeze. Exactly the same thing happened to Hitler. He launched in June. By the time he got to Moscow, having seemingly conquered the country, he was defeated by the weather. For Russia, this is the foundation of everything. In the same way that the foundation of national security for the United States is controlling the two oceans, naval power. This is their fundamental. Now, the problem was this. After the fall of the Soviet Union, which they blamed on us, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Ukraine was independent. The distance between the northern border of Ukraine and Moscow was 260 miles by road tree. Take the side road a little longer. The point is that Russia faced, from the beginning of the fall of the Soviet Union, a catastrophic situation. Now, you and I know that the Americans could always be trusted. But the Russians have a somewhat different view. And it was desperate that they move the border west. Now, they couldn't do it fast. They didn't build a military fast enough. They needed a lot more chaos going on. And they waited for this moment. And they struck. Now, why did the United States have to get involved? Because if Ukraine fell, the Russians would be once again on the border of NATO. And those of us who spent some time at the Fulda Gap will remember that that wasn't a really heartwarming period of our lives. In other words, the United States could not give the Russians what they needed, and the Russians could not give the Americans what they needed, and so that's when wars begin. It does not begin because Putin is salivating crazily. He may well be, but that's not where they begin. It certainly doesn't begin because Biden is stupid. He may be, but that's not why the war begins. We can make all these claims about politicians leading us into war, but it was hardwired. It was hardwired that Russia at some point had to go into Ukraine. It was hardwired that the United States would have to resist. The American strategy The Russian strategy was to send forces in. The American strategy was to have native forces, as we used to call it, Ukrainians, armed to the teeth with American weapons. We stand back, take no bodies coming in at Dover Air Force Base, thank God. Ukrainians fight for their country, and we make sure they don't lose. The critical strategy of the United States is not winning. It's preventing a loss. Because if there is preventing a loss at a certain point, the Russians will raise questions about their leadership. Also, they'll raise questions about being drafted. They started out with a small military because of a massive intelligence failure on their part. First, they completely miscalculated the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians really hate the Russians. Somebody in FSB missed that. Two, they miscalculated the Germans. They thought the Germans would stick with them because they needed oil, but a trip was brought to the United States by the Chancellor, and he said, oh, I forgot, I am for the United States, excuse me, yes. And thirdly, he completely misunderstood. FSB completely misunderstood the United States. It saw that we were bad-mouthing each other, that we were enraged at everything, that we believed in the deep state and everything else. They didn't remember what the old KGB knew. This is the way we always are. We're always pissed off at somebody else. He genuinely thought this was the moment because of what he thought was instability in the United States, not just healthy exercise. And as a result, he attacked from a stupid formation. 3 armored columns, hundreds of miles apart, rushing down to envelop something that isn't there. There is no center of gravity to the Ukrainian army. Plus, those of you who ever were in Germany and ever had the pleasure of watching a Russian exercise, logistics is their biggest problem. They cannot manage moving forward at a rapid pace and keeping the fuel going too. And that's what happened to them. Aside from some anti-tank missiles that work pretty well. So we are now in a war which does not in any way involve China. In fact, the Chinese abstained when the UN voted on condemning Russia. Now that's a big deal because your allies for forever, like a marriage, you don't abstain. You go vote right. They didn't. This was your basic screw you to Russia, if there needed to be one. So now Russia is sitting there. What do you do in this situation? You declare that you're insane because ever you get into a bar fight, pretend to be insane, okay? And he's been to bar fights, and he is. I'm going to nuke you. I'm going to use dirty nukes on you. I'm going to nuke your mother. I'm everybody that I can nuke. He's not an idiot. He knows that he's going to turn into radioactive dust personally if he does this. He knows that's not an option. Why does he do it? Here's where we get perspective. We have to stay calm. You have to say, he's doing it because his back's against the wall and he's got to do something. Be calm, which is not what we're good at, but this is what's going on there.